Israel, once lush and abundant, now lay parched and broken. 3 years without rain, the land and its people withering under a silent, merciless sky. The drought was more than physical. It mirrored a nation's spiritual emptiness, torn between the forgotten God of their ancestors and the empty promises of Baal. In the heart of this crisis stood two figures: King Ahab, powerless despite his throne, and Elijah, the lone prophet, sustained by faith and called to confront the king. Their collision would decide the fate of Israel, a showdown between royal authority and divine truth. Elijah journeyed through the devastated land, burdened by his mission but unwavering, meeting Obadiah, the secret believer, who would deliver his message to Ahab. With Elijah's vow to face the king, the stage was set for a confrontation on Mount Carmel that would end years of suffering and indecision. Ahab confronted Elijah, blaming him for Israel's misery, but Elijah turned the accusation back, declaring the true cause was the king's own rebellion against God. The moment demanded a reckoning, and Elijah was ready to settle the matter for all to see. Elijah issued a bold challenge: gather all Israel and the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel for a public test. The God who answers by fire is the true God. With the nation watching, the time for wavering was over. A single, undeniable miracle would force Israel to choose. Word of the great contest spread like wildfire across the barren land. Messengers rode from village to village, carrying the king's summons to Mount Carmel. People began the long journey, desperate for answers and rain. After 3 silent years, the sky was finally going to speak. The prophets of Baal and Asherah also answered the call, all 850 of them. They marched up Carmel, ready to call upon their storm god. The mountain buzzed with thousands of voices, a sea of anxious faces. On one side stood the legion of Baal's prophets, on the other, Elijah alone. The air was thick with tension. Who would prevail? Elijah let the scene sink in, allowing the people to witness the full scale of the nation's idolatry. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the audience was waiting. With all eyes fixed upon him, Elijah stepped forward and addressed the massive crowd. His voice boomed across the mountainside, clear and strong, leaving no room for misunderstanding. He did not begin with a prayer or a prophecy, but with a piercing question that went straight to the heart of their spiritual confusion. "How long will you waver between two opinions?" he asked them. The Hebrew word for waver can also mean to limp or to dance between two sides. He was painting a picture of a people who were spiritually crippled, unable to walk a straight path. They were trying to worship the Lord on one day and Baal on the next, hoping to get the best of both worlds. Elijah's question exposed the core of Israel's problem. They had not completely rejected God, but they had not fully committed to him either. They were trying to hedge their bets. This division had left them weak, confused, and powerless. Elijah forced them to confront their indecision. He laid out the choice in the plainest possible terms. If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him. There could be no middle ground. There was no room for divided loyalties. A choice had to be made. It was a call to commitment, a demand for a verdict. He was telling them that the time for limping and wavering was over. Today, they must choose. In response to this powerful challenge, the people said nothing. A heavy silence fell over the assembly. No one cheered for the Lord, no one shouted in support of Baal. They simply stood there, caught in their own indecision. Their silence was a confession of their guilt. They knew Elijah's words were true. They had been trying to serve two masters, and now, when confronted with the choice, they were paralyzed. They were spectators, waiting to see who would win the contest before they would pledge their allegiance. Their silence revealed the depth of the spiritual drought. Their hearts were as hard and unresponsive as the dry ground beneath their feet. This silence did not discourage Elijah. It only strengthened his resolve. He knew that words alone would not be enough to break through their hardened hearts. They needed to see. They needed a demonstration of power so undeniable that it would shatter their indecision and force them to their knees. He stood as the lone representative of the Lord. "I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left," he announced, highlighting his isolation. "But Baal has 450 prophets. He was setting the odds for them, making it clear that from a human perspective his cause was hopeless. The contest would not be a fair fight. It would be a miracle. With the contest set and the people as silent witnesses, Elijah gave the instructions. "Get 2 bulls," he said to the prophets of Baal. "Cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it." The instructions were simple and fair. The only variable would be the God being called upon. The prophets of Baal, confident, readily agreed. They constructed their altar, laying the wood carefully. Then they slaughtered the bull and arranged the pieces on the wood. Surely their God would answer their call and send fire. The prophets gathered around their altar, raised their hands and began their invocation. "O Baal, answer us." They were putting on a show for the people, for the king and for their God. But as the morning wore on, nothing happened. There was not even a whisper of a response from the heavens. Elijah stood off to the side, letting their failure unfold. The great contest had begun with a profound and deafening silence. As the hours passed and the sun reached its peak, the prophets' chants curdled into desperation. Their calls gave way to frantic energy. They were shouting, their voices growing hoarse. The plea became a scream hurled at an unresponsive sky. They began a frenzied dance around the altar, born of mounting panic. Their carefully constructed ceremony was falling apart, replaced by chaos. Their God was silent. The spectacle was losing its power. Here they were, leaping and shouting like madmen, and receiving no answer. Their dance grew more frantic, a physical manifestation of their inner turmoil. The sky remained silent and blue. It was a public humiliation. Every moment was another crack in the foundation of their authority. They could not even summon a single spark. Their frenzy only highlighted their powerlessness. He allowed the full extent of their God's impotence to be laid bare for all to see. They needed to witness this complete and utter failure. Before he could show them the power of the true God, he had to let them see the absolute lack of power in the false one. Baal was nothing. At noon, Elijah decided it was time to speak. He had let them perform for hours, and their failure was undeniable. He walked closer, and with biting sarcasm began to mock them. "Shout louder," he taunted. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is busy or traveling." He was not just mocking the prophets, he was dismantling the very concept of their God. Elijah's ridicule pushed the prophets of Baal over the edge. They took his mocking advice seriously and began to shout louder. The contrast was powerful. Frantic, sweating prophets versus Elijah, calm and in complete control. He was showing Israel that the God they feared was a joke. The mockery was a crucial part of the lesson. Before people could turn to the true God, they first had to laugh at the false one. Elijah was breaking the spell of idolatry with the power of ridicule. Driven mad by Elijah's taunts and their own failure, the prophets of Baal resorted to their most extreme ritual. If shouts and dancing would not work, perhaps pain and blood would. They grabbed swords and spears. In a terrifying display of self-mutilation, they began to slash themselves. Blood flowed freely, running down their bodies and staining their robes, mixing with the sweat and dust. This was a common practice in some ancient pagan religions, a belief that the gods could be moved by the sight of their followers' suffering and the shedding of their blood. They were offering their own pain as a sacrifice, a final horrific plea for their God to intervene. The scene on the mountain turned from pitiful to grotesque. The air was filled with the smell of sweat, and now the metallic scent of blood. The prophets' cries were no longer just shouts, but screams of pain. They writhed and staggered around the altar, their bodies covered in self-inflicted wounds, their minds lost in a religious frenzy. They were giving everything they had, holding nothing back. They were demonstrating the ultimate devotion to Baal, hoping their agony would please him and compel him to act. They were caught in a spiral of escalating violence and desperation, unable to stop, convinced that just one more cut, one more scream might be the one that finally worked. The people watched in horrified fascination. This was the dark side of the religion that Queen Jezebel had imported. It was a worship based on pain, fear, and a desperate need to appease an angry, distant God. What kind of God would demand such a thing from his followers? The sight of the bleeding, screaming prophets must have been deeply unsettling. It was a stark contrast to the stories they knew of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who asked for obedience and justice, not self-harm. The bloody spectacle revealed the true nature of Baal worship. It was a religion of death, not life. It took from its followers and gave nothing in return. And still nothing happened. Despite the blood, despite the pain, despite the hours of frantic prophecy, there was no answer. No voice, no sign, no fire. The wood on the altar remained untouched. The sky remained silent. Their God was not moved by their devotion, their dances, their shouts, or their blood. The afternoon began to fade, and the time for the evening sacrifice approached. The prophets were exhausted, wounded, and utterly defeated. Their frenzies slowly died down, replaced by the ragged gasps of men who had given their all and received absolutely nothing. Their failure was now complete, total, and undeniable. As the sun began to descend toward the western sea, a profound quiet fell over Mount Carmel. The prophets of Baal, having raved and bled for hours, finally collapsed in exhaustion. Their hoarse cries faded away, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and the wind whispering over the mountaintop. They lay or sat slumped around their cold, blood-spattered altar, a picture of utter defeat. The energy that had driven them was gone, leaving behind only the shame of their public failure. Their bodies were wounded, their spirits were broken, and their God had proven to be an empty promise. The great sound and fury of their worship had signified nothing. The silence that followed was more powerful than all their shouting had been. It was a heavy, condemning silence that confirmed Elijah's point. Baal was not sleeping or traveling. He was not real. He did not exist. There was no one to hear their prayers or see their sacrifices. They had been crying out to a void. For hours, the entire nation of Israel had watched this demonstration of nothingness. They had seen the best followers of Baal give everything they had, only to be met with absolute silence. The illusion had been shattered. The curtain had been pulled back, and behind it, there was nothing at all. The people in the crowd stood motionless, processing what they had just witnessed. The day had started with them wavering, uncertain who to follow. Now, one side of the argument had been completely demolished. The case for Baal was closed, his prophets were defeated, and his power was proven to be a lie. The silence on the mountain was the final verdict. It created a space, an opening in the hearts and minds of the people. It cleared away the noise and confusion of idolatry, preparing the way for a different voice to be heard. The failure of the many had set the stage for the actions of the one. Now, it was Elijah's turn. He had waited patiently all day, allowing the counterfeit to be fully exposed. He had not rushed. He had let the lesson sink in deep. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. The time for the evening sacrifice, a traditional time of prayer to the Lord, was approaching. The air was still thick with tension, but it was a different kind of tension. Now it was not the frenzy of the prophets, but the quiet, intense anticipation of the crowd. They had seen what man's religion could do. Now they were about to see what the one true God would do. All eyes turned from the fallen prophets to the solitary figure of Elijah. With the prophets of Baal silenced, Elijah stepped forward. He walked over to a pile of stones that lay in ruins. This was an old altar to the Lord, one that had been torn down. Elijah's first act was one of restoration. He called the people closer to him. The crowd now surged forward, drawn to his quiet authority. Elijah began to pick up the stones. He chose 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel. They were a covenant family, a nation chosen by God. Elijah's altar was a statement of spiritual unity. Each stone he lifted was an act of faith. He was preparing the hearts of the people to be mended. A hush fell over the mountain as the people watched. Elijah was demonstrating a different kind of faith. The altar was rising again, a beacon of hope. Once the altar was rebuilt, Elijah did something strange, baffling everyone. He dug a large trench around the altar, enough to hold a great deal of water. In a drought-stricken land, this seemed like madness. Then Elijah commanded, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and wood." The people gasped. He had them soak everything completely, filling the trench to the brim. This removed any possibility of trickery. Elijah was demonstrating his absolute confidence in God's power, showing the people that God did not need any help. When the answer came, No one could deny its divine origin. As the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, the moment all of creation seemed to be waiting for, Elijah stepped toward the waterlogged altar. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the mountain. The frenzied noise of the Baal prophets had long since faded, replaced by a deep and profound silence from the thousands of onlookers. All the preparations were complete. The stage was set for the final act of this divine drama. Elijah simply approached the altar as a humble servant, his posture one of reverence and quiet expectation. He lifted his eyes to heaven and began to pray. His prayer was simple, direct, and filled with a calm, powerful faith. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, addressing God by his covenant name. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again." The moment Elijah finished his simple prayer, the sky answered. It was not a slow-building flame or a small spark. A brilliant, terrifying bolt of fire fell from the clear blue sky. It was a supernatural blaze, a raw display of divine power that struck the altar with incredible force. The fire did not just burn the dry parts, it consumed everything. It vaporized the drenched pieces of the bull, a sacrifice instantly accepted by God. It incinerated the waterlogged wood, turning the saturated logs into ash in a fraction of a second. The intensity of the heavenly fire was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, a pure and powerful energy unleashed from another world. But the fire did not stop there. It was impossibly, miraculously thorough. After consuming the sacrifice and the wood, the flames leapt to the 12 stones. The fire of the Lord burned the very stones, reducing the solid rock to dust and powder. It was a demonstration of power that defied all the laws of nature. Fire does not normally consume stone. This was no ordinary flame. It was a visible manifestation of the awesome power of the Creator. It showed that the God of Israel was not just a God, but the God, with absolute authority over every element of the world he had made. Even then, the miracle was not complete. The fire spread outward, licking up the dust of the ground. It was as if the very ground was being purified by the holy presence. And then came the most astonishing part. The fire descended into the trench that was filled with water. The divine flame plunged into the water and licked it up completely. In a hissing, steaming instant, all the water in the trench vanished, turned to vapor by the incredible heat. The ground where the trench had been was left scorched and dry. The fire of God had consumed the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water. Nothing was left. The altar that Elijah had so carefully rebuilt was gone, replaced by a patch of smoking, blackened earth. The demonstration was absolute and undeniable. Every obstacle that Elijah had put in place had been obliterated to make the point even clearer. This was a power so immense, so total, that it left no room for doubt. God had answered. He had answered with a fire that did not just burn but consumed. He had shown up in a way that was terrifying, awe-inspiring, and utterly unforgettable, proving his existence and his supreme power before the eyes of the entire nation. The silence on the mountain was shattered not by the fire, but by the collective gasp of thousands of people witnessing the impossible. One moment there was a soaking wet altar, the next a pillar of fire from heaven, and then nothing but scorched earth. The sheer raw power of the event stunned them into silence. Their minds, honestly, struggled to comprehend what their eyes had just seen. This was not a clever trick. This was not a natural phenomenon like lightning. The sky had been perfectly clear. This was a direct, personal, and overwhelming response from a God who had been silent for so long, a God they had tried so hard to forget. This was the sign they had been waiting for, the definitive proof Elijah had promised. The contest was over. The verdict was in. Baal, with his 450 screaming, bleeding prophets, had produced nothing but a pathetic and bloody spectacle. The Lord, with his one quiet, faithful servant, had answered with a fire that consumed stone and vaporized water. The contrast could not have been more absolute. All the arguments, all the indecision, all the wavering between two opinions were burned away in that single holy flame. The truth had been demonstrated in a way that no one present could ever dispute or forget. The fire was more than just a display of raw power, it was a message. It was a fire of judgment, consuming the sacrifice that stood in for the sins of the people. It was a fire of purification, cleansing the very ground that had been defiled by idolatry. And it was a fire of acceptance, showing that God had heard the prayer of his servant and was ready to turn back to his people. The empty space where the altar had stood was now the most sacred spot in the nation, a place where heaven had touched earth and revealed the awesome reality of the living God. The people were left staring at the aftermath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a long moment nobody moved. They were frozen, caught between terror and wonder. The fear of God, a feeling they had not experienced for a very long time, fell upon the entire assembly. This was not the cowering fear they felt for the cruel and demanding Baal. This was a deep, trembling awe in the presence of a being of infinite power and holiness. They had challenged God, and he had answered. They had demanded a sign, and he had given them one that exceeded all their expectations. The debate was over. The evidence was in. Now only one thing was left: their response. The fire had done its work. Now it was time for the people to speak. The massive crowd on Mount Carmel remained frozen, statues carved from fear and wonder, eyes wide with the after-image of the heavenly fire. The air smelled of burned stone. The people had seen the impossible, their minds now shockingly clear. Then slowly the people began to stir and fell to their knees. They fell on their faces in the dust, a universal act of surrender. It was the humble worship of creatures before their Creator. They were worshippers, united in their awe. Lying there in the dust, they were stripped of everything but their shared humanity. Their faces in the dust symbolized the turning of their hearts back to God. Now they were lying low in submission, their choice finally made. In the silence of their prostration, a new foundation of faith was being laid. From the dust a voice arose. It was a single trembling cry, a confession torn from the depths of a soul that had just witnessed a miracle. The Lord, He is God. Then another voice joined in, and another and another. Soon a murmur swelled into a mighty roar that rolled across the mountain and echoed through the valleys below. It was the sound of a nation finding its voice again, not in a desperate chant to a false idol, but in a unified declaration of truth. The silence of awe was broken by a chorus of confession, a powerful, spontaneous creed shouted by thousands of grateful hearts. They were no longer silent, they were no longer wavering. They knew, the Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God. They repeated the phrase over and over, each time with more conviction. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a profound revelation. It was an admission of their failure and a declaration of God's victory. They were publicly renouncing the years they had spent chasing after Baal. They were casting aside the lies they had been told and embracing the truth that had just been burned into their memory. This was not a pledge coerced by a king or a priest. It was a voluntary, joyful and overwhelming response to seeing God's glory revealed in a way that could not be denied. Elijah stood and listened, his heart surely soaring. This was the sound he had longed to hear. This was the fruit of his lonely stand, his fearless confrontation and his simple prayer. He had stood as one man against hundreds, but he had never been truly alone. Now he was surrounded by thousands of voices affirming the reality of the God he served. The people were finally choosing their side. They were turning their hearts back, just as he had prayed. The confession was a binding promise, a new covenant being made between the people and their God on that fiery mountaintop. It was the sound of a spiritual resurrection. Their chant was a powerful act of defiance against the regime of Ahab and Jezebel. For years, the official religion of the kingdom had been the worship of Baal. To declare that the Lord was God was a politically dangerous statement. But after seeing the fire from heaven, they no longer feared a human king or queen. They had encountered a power far greater. Their fear of God had erased their fear of man. The people were reclaiming their spiritual heritage, declaring their allegiance not to the throne in Samaria, but to the throne in heaven. The turning point was complete. The people had returned. As the people's confession echoed across the mountain, Elijah's demeanor shifted. The calm teacher and humble servant became, well, an executor of divine justice. His voice cut through the air, sharp and authoritative. "Seize the prophets of Baal! Don't let a single one get away!" His order was swift and uncompromising. The same people who had just been lying in the dust now rose to their feet, their awe turning into righteous anger. They were filled with a new zeal, a desire to purge the land of the false prophets who had led them astray for so long, who had mocked their suffering, and who served a God of bloody, useless rituals. Empowered by Elijah's command, the people acted immediately. They surged forward and surrounded the 450 prophets of Baal. The pagan priests who had started the day so confident and proud were now terrified and trapped. They were exhausted, wounded from their self-mutilation, and utterly defeated. There was nowhere for them to run. The crowd, which had once been their audience, was now their captor. They were seized, their fine robes grabbed by the rough hands of farmers and shepherds who had been deceived by them for years. Their power was gone, their influence had vanished, and their fate was now in the hands of the prophet of the God they had challenged. Elijah led the captured prophets down from the heights of Mount Carmel. He took them to the Kishon Valley, to the brook that ran through the plain below. This location was significant. The Kishon Brook was a place of a famous victory in Israel's history, where God had given them triumph over their enemies. Now it would be a place of judgment once again. According to the law of God, as written in the book of Deuteronomy, anyone who tried to lead the people of Israel away from the Lord to worship other gods was to be put to death. This was not an act of personal vengeance for Elijah. It was the carrying out of God's established law. There in the valley, the judgment was executed. The false prophets who had poisoned the spiritual life of the nation were eliminated. It was a harsh and decisive action, a necessary surgery to remove the cancer of idolatry that had nearly killed the nation. This act was a clear and brutal signal that the era of Baal worship in Israel was over. There could be no compromise, no wavering between two opinions. The choice had been made, and the consequences were now being fully realized. It was a grim end to the day's events, but it was essential to ensure that the turning of the people's hearts would last. With the false prophets gone, a new reality began to settle over the nation. The decisive victory on Mount Carmel was the end of an era. The state-sponsored religion of Baal had been publicly discredited. Its priests were gone, its power broken. A new chapter was beginning for Israel. The spiritual condition for the rain's return had been met. Now the physical drought could also come to an end. For King Ahab, it must have been a day of profound shock. It was a statement of incredible faith. He sent Ahab off to feast, while he himself prepared to pray. Now only one thing remained, to pray for the rain. The turning point was complete. After the fire and the judgment, Elijah ascended to the top of Mount Carmel to pray. He sought solitude to commune with God. Elijah understood the fire was only the first part. The promise of restoration would only be complete with the coming of rain. He bowed low to the ground in intense concentration and deep humility. He was simply a humble servant pleading with his God. Elijah had told Ahab he heard the sound of a heavy rain when the sky was still clear. He was praying for its fulfillment, a persistent appeal based on God's character and the people's repentance. The way was clear for God's blessing to flow. Once again, he prayed and interceded, putting his faith into action through persistent prayer. Prayer is often a battle of persistence, and Elijah's experience on Carmel was no exception. He sent his servant to look toward the sea. 7 times Elijah prayed, and 7 times the servant returned with the same report: there is nothing. Elijah's persistence teaches us that faith doesn't give up. Finally, on the 7th trip, the servant came back. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. For Elijah, it was everything. It was the first drop of the coming storm, the physical evidence that his prayers had been heard and that God was on the move. That tiny cloud was all the confirmation Elijah needed. Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you. It was coming fast and with great force before the storm broke. The sky, which had been clear just moments before, began to transform. The heavens grew dark and menacing. The rain began to fall not as a gentle sprinkle but as a torrential downpour. The land finally received the relief it had been crying out for, symbolizing the cleansing of their sin. The miracle on Mount Carmel was complete, moving from the fire of judgment to the water of grace. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is more than just a dramatic account from ancient history. It's a timeless message that speaks directly to the core of our own lives and struggles. It's a powerful reminder that faith is not a passive belief, but a courageous choice. Elijah's call echoes through the centuries. If the Lord is God, follow him. The events on that mountain also reveal the profound difference between true and false worship. It's about resting in his power, not striving in our own. His story inspires us to never underestimate the impact one person can have. Ultimately, the fire from heaven and the rain that followed are a beautiful picture of the character of God.